My name is Claire Benton, and at 35 years old, I watched my brother walk into our funding meeting completely unaware that I was the one sitting across the table. 10 years ago, he laughed at me across our parents' dining room table, said my startup was a phase, a hobby, something I'd grow out of. Everyone chuckled. I smiled back. And then I got to work. Now he needed funding to save his collapsing company, and I was the one holding the term sheet. Before I tell you how the roles reversed, and what I said when he finally realized who he was pitching, to make sure to hit like and subscribe. It helps more people find stories like this one. This is for every woman who's been mocked, overlooked, or dismissed by her own family and built something they never saw coming. Thanksgiving at my parents' house was always a polished affair mahogany table set with matching silverware, linen napkins folded into perfect triangles, the smell of roasted rosemary turkey drifting through the hall like some sacred tradition. My father would carve the bird while my mother refilled wine glasses, and my brother Michael would dominate the conversation with stories of his latest business victories. Promotions, funding rounds, brand partnerships. He made success sound inevitable, like gravity. Everyone listened, everyone admired. And I smiled, nodded, and pretended I didn't notice how invisible I had become. That year, I had something new to share. For the first time in a long time, I had news of my own, not borrowed, not theoretical, not someone else's win I was applauding from the sidelines. I had resigned from my job at the marketing agency and was working on launching my own platform, a startup that used AI to optimize personal budgeting for gig workers. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't VC backed. But it was mine, and I believed in it. I waited patiently through Michael's detailed account of how he'd closed a partnership with a logistics firm that doubled his department's quarterly numbers. My uncle clapped him on the back. My dad said something about true leadership. My mother beamed. When the conversation dipped just slightly, I cleared my throat and said I'd left my job to start something of my own. The room didn't fall silent. It just kind of paused. Like a hiccup in a playlist, I explained my idea, cautiously at first. I described the problem I wanted to solve, the prototype I'd been working on, the advisors who said it had potential. I watched their faces as I spoke, hoping for some flicker of curiosity or pride. Instead, I got polite smiles. And then, from Michael, a soft chuckle, sharp and knowing. He leaned back in his chair, swirled his wine, and made a comment about how everyone had a startup these days, followed by a suggestion that maybe I'd finally get my rebellious phase out of my system. Someone laughed. I couldn't even tell who. My aunt? My cousin? It didn't matter. The sound of it cracked something in me, slow and deep. I tried to hold my smile, tried to keep talking, but the heat in my face betrayed me. My father offered a vague nod and asked if I had run the numbers. My mother asked what my backup plan was. Michael piled on, casually questioning whether I understood how brutal tech fundraising really was. I gave short answers, each one smaller than the last. Every sentence I spoke felt like it was shrinking under their gaze. I barely tasted dinner. The food blurred together: cranberry, gravy, potatoes, all of it dense in my mouth like glue. I stared at the china, the wine stains on napkins, the glint of the chandelier above us. This table, once a place of warmth and safety, had become a jury box. And I was the defendant. After dessert, I excused myself early, claiming I wasn't feeling well. No one protested. No one followed me to the door. I stepped into the night air, the cold hitting my cheeks with a sting that felt earned. I sat in my car for a long time, hands clenched around the steering wheel, trying not to cry. But the tears came anyway. Not loud or messy, just quiet, exhausted surrender. It wasn't just that they laughed, it was that they didn't even consider they might be wrong. That I might be more than the girl who always colored outside the lines, who switched majors twice in college, who never quite measured up to Michael's polished trajectory. To them, I was a well-meaning wanderer, someone who'd eventually settle into something practical. I drove home in silence. No music, no radio, just the hum of the road and the steady pulse of humiliation threading through my chest. When I got back to my apartment, tiny, cluttered, dimly lit, I sank onto the couch and stared at the ceiling. My laptop blinked from the coffee table, still open to a draft pitch deck. I thought about closing it, about walking away, about finding a job with a steady paycheck and forgetting I ever thought I could build something. But somewhere, beneath the ache, a different feeling stirred. Not rage, not vengeance, something colder, cleaner, a line being drawn. I realized then that I would never prove myself to them through words. I could build the most innovative product in the world, and they'd still see me as the girl who didn't know what she was doing. So I stopped trying to convince them. I would show them, someday, but not for their sake. That night, I reopened the deck, not because I was ready, but because quitting now would mean letting their laughter decide the ending. And I wasn't going to let them write the last page. The first real attempt didn't begin with a funding round or a product launch or even a proper workspace. It began in a cramped studio apartment where the heater made more noise than heat and the kitchen sink backed up twice a week. It began at a folding table I dragged from a thrift store, where my laptop teetered between a stack of financial books and a half-empty mug of cold coffee. There was no grand opening, no press release, just me, my idea, and the kind of desperate clarity that only shows up when you've already been told you'll fail. I didn't have a tech background. I had a marketing degree and a stubborn streak. What I had seen, working years with freelancers and small business owners, was how impossible it was for them to manage their finances without tools built for them. They used spreadsheets they didn't understand, apps that weren't flexible, and bank accounts that punished them for inconsistency. I wanted to build something lean, intuitive, and smart, something that adapted to chaos rather than punished it. I wasn't trying to become the next unicorn. I just wanted to solve a real problem for people like me. The problem was, no one cared. I sent out my first pitch deck to 10 angel investors I had found through LinkedIn and forums. No responses? I revised the deck, shortened it, then lengthened it, added user personas, rewrote the mission statement 5 times. On the 11th try, I got a reply short, dismissive, generic. They weren't currently exploring projects in my vertical. I didn't even know what vertical I was in anymore. Just that every rejection made me question if I'd built a house on sand. I joined forums, went to meetup groups, sat through seminars where I didn't understand half the acronyms people tossed around like currency. I'd nod and smile and write everything down, Googling furiously the second I got home. I listened to podcasts in the shower, took free courses at midnight. I learned what churn meant, how to calculate burn rate, what CAC was and why it mattered. I created wireframes with duct tape logic, watching hours of YouTube tutorials to figure out how to mock up something that looked real enough to show. Every day I worked 12, sometimes 15 hours. There was no balance, no routine, no finish line. Just a whiteboard I got for free on Craigslist, and a calendar full of crossed-out names of people who said no. My body hurt constantly, shoulders locked from hunching over a screen, eyes strained, wrists stiff. I ate poorly, slept worse, and flinched every time a bill arrived in the mail. But I kept going, not because I felt inspired, but because stopping felt worse. I remember one morning, I had scraped together enough money for coffee at a nearby cafe where startup people worked out of MacBooks, speaking too loudly about cap tables and term sheets. I sat at a corner table, rehearsing my pitch in my head, when I overheard two guys talking about their new AI-driven marketing app. They sounded so confident, so sure. One of them had raised $200,000 in a month. I wanted to interrupt, to ask them how they'd done it. Instead, I just sat there, clutching my notebook, feeling small and stupid and hopelessly out of place. But I went home and pitched again, sent the deck to a small fund in the Midwest that claimed to support underserved founders. No response. Sent it to a female founder collective. They said I needed traction. Sent it to an accelerator. They wanted video testimonials, real users, a team. I had none of that. Just an idea, a half-working prototype, and a heart running on fumes. The worst part wasn't the rejection. It was the silence. The emails never answered. The calendar slots that stayed empty. The way hope thinned each time I hit send. My inbox became a graveyard of ignored outreach. I started to dread logging in, but I kept doing it. One night, the power went out in my building for 6 hours. I sat in the dark, phone at 14%, staring at my notes by candlelight, thinking maybe this was it. Maybe I'd gone as far as I could. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe the whole thing was just an exercise in self-delusion. But even as that thought settled, something inside me fought back, not loudly, but like a hand gripping a ledge. I hadn't come this far just to say I tried. I didn't need applause. I just needed one person to believe in this. Just one. So I kept pitching. I kept refining. I rebuilt the prototype from scratch using a low-code platform I barely understood. I created fake user flows to demonstrate the experience. I wrote a cold email to a former professor and asked for honest feedback, even if it was brutal. She tore it apart and then said it was the most persistent thing she'd seen in years. She gave me 2 names. I wrote to both. One replied. And just like that, a door cracked open. Not all the way, not enough to walk through, but enough to see that light still existed on the other side. I wasn't there yet. I wasn't even close. But I was still standing. And for now, that would have to be enough. It's strange how quiet failure can be. Not the kind of failure that comes with a crash, or a phone call, or some dramatic confrontation, but the kind that arrives in pieces, missed emails, unopened responses, bank statements you read twice because you're sure something must be wrong. The kind that creeps in slowly and then all at once, until one day you look around and realize the only thing left in the room is the sound of you breathing. It had been nearly a year since I left my job, a full year since I'd stood in my parents' dining room and told them I was building something. I could still see my brother's smirk like it was burned into the back of my eyes. That moment had fueled me for months, but even anger runs out. Even pride needs sleep. And I hadn't had a full night's rest in weeks. I was behind on rent. Again. My landlord had stopped calling and started leaving quiet reminders taped to my door in passive-aggressive handwriting. The kind that made it clear I was no longer a name, just a number in red. I had maxed out my credit cards. My prototype had bugs I didn't know how to fix. And my inbox had become a monument to silence. 72 pitches, 4 soft maybes, 0 yeses. I started avoiding mirrors. Not because of how I looked, though I looked awful, but because of how I stared at myself, like I was trying to find the version of me that had believed this could work. I used to feel so sure, so determined, but now everything felt blurred, like I'd been underwater too long and forgotten what the surface felt like. I stopped returning messages from friends. What was I supposed to say? That I was still building? That I was figuring things out? They were getting promotions, planning weddings, having babies. I was still refreshing my striped dashboard, hoping for a miracle. I didn't want their pity. I didn't want to explain. So I just disappeared. Most days, I didn't leave the apartment. I'd sit at my desk, open my laptop, and stare at the same 3 browser tabs for hours. Sometimes I pretended to work just to convince myself I hadn't quit. I'd rewrite the same section of copy 10 times, delete and retype the same headline until the words lost all meaning. There were days when I didn't eat until 9 p.m., when my hands shook from too much coffee and not enough food. I knew it wasn't sustainable. I just didn't know what else to do. One night, I got a call from my mother. I let it ring. Then a text. Just checking in. Hope you're okay? I stared at the message for a long time. I wasn't okay. But I couldn't bring myself to say that. What would I even say? That she'd been right to doubt me? That Michael's laugh had echoed in my head so many times I could still hear it when I tried to sleep? I opened a blank document and started writing a resignation email to myself. Not to anyone specific, just a farewell letter to the version of me that had believed I could do this. I wrote about how hard I had tried, how maybe that was enough. I told myself that quitting didn't make me weak, that maybe some dreams weren't meant to be built by everyone. I didn't cry, I just typed. Slowly, quietly. But then something strange happened. I minimized the window. I didn't close it. I just left it there. I stared at it for an hour. Then 2. And instead of sending it or deleting it, I opened my inbox again. Out of habit. More than hope. That's when I saw it. A reply from one of the contacts my old professor had introduced me to. It was brief. Direct. She said she'd glanced at my deck and wanted to know more. Asked if I was available for a 10-minute call the next afternoon. I reread the message 4 times. It wasn't a yes, it wasn't even close. But it was not a no. And after everything, that was enough to stop me from closing the laptop. I sat there, frozen, overwhelmed not by joy, but by confusion. My heart didn't leap. I didn't jump up and scream. I just exhaled, slowly. Like I'd been holding my breath for a year. I got up, drank some water, and sat back down. I started rewriting the pitch deck. Not the visuals, not the buzzwords, just the core, the thing I'd forgotten while trying to impress everyone. Why I started, what I saw, who I was building it for. I stripped away the marketing language and got honest. Not because I thought it would win her over, but because I needed to remind myself what I was fighting for. I didn't sleep that night. Not because of anxiety, but because something in me had shifted. Not hope. Not yet. Just friction. A spark. Like a match dragged across a rough surface, not quite lit, but close. I didn't know where it would go. But for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was drowning. Almost giving up taught me something I hadn't learned in any business book or podcast or panel. It taught me that grit isn't loud. It's not made of speeches or victory laps. Sometimes it's just choosing not to send the goodbye email, choosing to open the browser one more time, choosing, despite everything, to stay in the room. And I had stayed, barely. Quietly. But I had. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything shifted. I'd been waiting all day for the call, not pacing, not even moving much, just sitting at my desk in that same stiff chair, trying to pretend this was just another meeting, and not the moment my entire life might turn a degree towards something better. The woman I was speaking with was named Renee. She ran a small venture network that focused on early-stage startups with female founders. Nothing huge, no Sandhill Road glitz. But they had a reputation for backing scrappy, product-minded ideas, the kind that didn't always shine in glossy decks but solved real problems. The 10-minute call turned into 30. She was sharp, asked hard questions, wanted numbers, not just stories. She didn't coo over my mission or compliment my branding. She asked about retention, my cost of acquisition, how I plan to scale with limited dev resources. I answered everything as best I could, honestly, directly, and without apology. I didn't try to impress her. I just told the truth. At the end of the call, she said something I'd never heard from anyone in her position before. "I think there's something here." I didn't jump out of my chair. I didn't scream, I just sat there, the words echoing like they'd been spoken in a different language. Something here. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a contract. But it was possibility. It was oxygen. A few days later, she introduced me to a small group of angel investors who ran a pre-seed round for projects like mine. Within 2 weeks, I had my first commitment, $25,000. It wasn't life-changing, not in a venture sense, but to me it might as well have been $25 million. I refreshed the wire transfer confirmation 4 times before it felt real. My fingers trembled as I saw the balance change in my account. After months of scraping by, of doubting everything, of shrinking into a shell of the woman I used to be, someone had said yes. Someone had looked at what I was building and decided it was worth backing. I called no one. Not my parents, not my brother, not the friends who hadn't asked how the business was going in months. I kept it to myself, not out of spite, but preservation. This was mine. This tiny, golden moment of victory belonged to me and the silence I had built it in. With that $25,000, I hired my first freelance developer, a brilliant woman named Rena, who had been laid off from a fintech company and wanted flexible work. She didn't blink at the shoestring budget. She said, "Let's make it work." And she did. We met every morning at 8 a.m. over video calls with low resolution and bad audio, and together we rebuilt the product from the ground up. Suddenly, the walls of my apartment felt less like a cage and more like a lab. I wasn't building alone anymore. There was rhythm now. Progress. Features started taking shape. Onboarding screens that used to live only in my head were now functional. I saw users signing up. At first, just a few friends of friends. Connections from Reddit, but then dozens. Then hundreds. Not paying yet, but engaging, giving feedback, sharing the link. Something was moving. I watched heat maps of user clicks like they were constellations. I opened Google Analytics more than I checked social media. I sent customer feedback forms and read every word, sometimes with tears in my eyes. People didn't just use the app, they said it helped them. That it made managing their irregular income feel less overwhelming. That they didn't feel stupid anymore looking at their finances. One user wrote, "It's the first time I felt like money wasn't winning against me." I didn't tell Renee about that message, but it's the one I printed and taped to the wall above my desk. In the months that followed, the product grew. Rena introduced me to another part-time dev who came on board. I bartered equity for design help. A friend from a co-working space I used to frequent agreed to help with early marketing in exchange for a small stake. The company was still fragile, bootstrapped, duct taped together in places, but it was real people, real users, real momentum. And yet, I didn't post anything on LinkedIn. I didn't update my Instagram. I didn't text anyone in my family. I wasn't building for applause anymore. I was building because I finally believed the thing I had almost let go of had a place in the world. That belief didn't come from someone handing it to me. It came from clawing it out of silence, from waking up every morning and choosing not to quit. One night, about 3 months after the first wire hit my account, I walked into a corner store near my apartment to grab milk. The cashier asked how I was. I almost said fine, the way people do, but then I paused. I smiled. I said, "I'm good. Actually, really good." And I meant it. That night, I poured a glass of cheap wine, opened my laptop, and stared at my dashboard. The user count ticked past 1,000. it was just a number. But for me, it was everything. Growth didn't feel like victory. It felt like routine. Quiet, repetitive, thankless work that blurred the days together and made time stretch and snap like rubber bands. But buried inside that rhythm was a new kind of power, one I hadn't felt before. Not the fragile confidence that comes from a single win, but the kind that builds slowly, layer by layer, like sediment forming a foundation beneath your feet. My company was no longer an idea. It was an organism, and it was breathing. After the product stabilized and our small user base began to grow, I set new goals, not just user acquisition, but engagement, retention, actual impact. We tracked everything: clicks, drop-offs, session durations. I obsessed over the data, not because I didn't trust my instincts, but because I finally had something real to study. The numbers didn't care about ego. They showed what worked and what didn't. And I had learned to stop taking failure personally. We launched a referral system and saw a 28% jump in signups over 2 weeks. We redesigned onboarding and halved our churn rate in a month. Little wins stacked together. Most people didn't notice. We didn't get press. We weren't trending on Product Hunt. But every single day, a few more people used our platform. And more importantly, they came back. I still lived in the same apartment. Same flickering hallway light. Same cracked bathroom mirror. But my days were different now. I woke up early sometimes before my alarm because I wanted to see what changed overnight. I had stopped measuring my worth by outside validation. I had started measuring it in effort, in resilience, in the fact that, despite everything, I was still here. We made our first hire, a community manager named Jules, who had once worked in customer service for a major fintech company and burned out. She had empathy in her bones. Within 2 weeks, our user satisfaction scores climbed. People didn't just feel helped, they felt seen. Jules was the kind of teammate who made things feel lighter just by showing up. I couldn't afford her full-time. She joined part-time for equity and a stipend, but she believed in the product, in me, and I never took that for granted. I spent my nights learning about early-stage fundraising mechanics. I listened to podcasts in the shower and read term sheets in the bath. I took notes like I was preparing for the exam of my life. I didn't want to walk into another room and feel like I didn't belong. I wanted to know the language better than anyone in the room. Meanwhile, my family stayed quiet. No one called. No one asked. I saw Michael's posts online, new position, new award, polished photos with suited colleagues. He looked like success, and maybe he was. But I no longer flinched when I saw his face. I no longer imagined telling him what I'd built. I no longer waited for the day he'd acknowledge me. I had outgrown the part of me that needed him to see it. Still, sometimes I'd think back to that dinner. The laughter. The feeling of shrinking inside myself. I didn't want revenge. I just wanted to never feel that small again. We crossed 10,000 users quietly on a Wednesday afternoon. There were no balloons, no clapping. I made a small note in my journal, 10K, still standing. Then I got back to work. Because that's what growth was. Not glory, just consistency. One morning, I received an email from a founder I admired. She said she'd heard about our product from a colleague and wanted to chat. I read the message 3 times before responding. We had a call. It was short. She was direct. At the end of it, she said, "You've built something sticky. If you're ever raising, let me know." I didn't cry, but I sat still for a long time afterward, feeling the edges of myself settle into something I hadn't known I was missing. I wasn't trying to be taken seriously anymore. I was being taken seriously. We weren't profitable yet, but we were sustainable. I paid my team on time. I had a savings buffer. I started thinking long-term. For the first time in my life, Long-term didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a roadmap. I still didn't tell my parents. I still hadn't been invited to another family gathering. Part of me missed them. But a larger part had learned to live without their approval. I had built a new kind of family, one that showed up to stand-ups and strategy sessions, who sent memes after long work days, who stayed late not because they had to, but because they cared. One night, Jules and I stayed on a Zoom call late after a team retro. She said, this feels different, like a company that's not trying to be flashy, just trying to last. I didn't respond right away. I just let the words settle. That's what I wanted. Not fame, not validation, just durability. I was climbing quietly, and I wasn't stopping. It started with a podcast, a mid-tier founder-focused show I used to listen to during the hardest days, when my hands shook from caffeine and my inbox was a museum of rejection. One day, they reached out to me. Someone on the production team had heard about our platform through a user testimonial and wanted to feature me as a guest. At first, I thought it was a mistake. I reread the email 3 times before replying. Then I spent a full day debating whether to accept. I was still just building, still fixing bugs at midnight, still not where I wanted to be. But something in me said yes. The interview was remote. I sat on the edge of my bed, mic clipped to my hoodie, hands sweating. I expected the usual questions. How did you start? What's the mission? But they dug deeper. They asked about the nights I wanted to quit, about what kept me going, about the loneliness of being underestimated by the people who are supposed to know you best. And I told the truth. For the first time, publicly, I said it. My family never believed I could do this. They laughed. And I kept going anyway. The episode dropped 2 weeks later. I didn't even promote it. I just hoped it wouldn't flop. But then, the messages started. Not thousands, not viral. Just a steady trickle. Founders, freelancers, people in jobs they hated. Women who said they had never heard someone speak so plainly about what it meant to build from a place of doubt. A few investors too. Curious. Respectful. Interested. One of them asked if I was raising. I wasn't, technically. But I told him I'd consider it. I started to notice something shifting. It wasn't sudden, more like a tide slowly rising beneath my feet. People began reaching out to me not because I asked them to, but because they wanted to. I was invited to a small, invite-only panel for female-led startups in fintech, then another. I got a DM from a founder I used to idolize, asking if we could grab coffee. She wanted to learn how I was keeping churn so low. I still worked 12-hour days. I still answered support tickets myself when Jules was offline. But now, people responded to my emails. Investors who had once ghosted me now asked for meetings. Mentors who never had time suddenly offered open calendars. I wasn't chasing anymore. The room I'd been trying to get into for years had finally opened its doors, and I hadn't even knocked. They'd found me. At first, I didn't trust it. I kept waiting for the shoe to drop, for someone to say it was a mistake, that I didn't belong. But the calls kept coming. The offers got more serious. Someone offered to buy our product outright. I declined without hesitation, not because I was arrogant, but because I finally knew what I'd built and it wasn't for sale. I started thinking bigger. We redesigned the dashboard, launched new features, brought on a fractional CTO. I hired a part-time ops manager to help with internal systems. Our team expanded to 6. We moved into a tiny co-working space with flickering lights and bad coffee, and it still felt like a palace. Every desk was filled with someone who believed in what we were building, not because of the hype, but because they'd seen it grow from nothing. One evening, I stayed late to clean up after a late sprint. As I stacked chairs, I caught my reflection in the dark window, hair pulled back, hoodie stretched, eyes tired but focused. I didn't look like a CEO, but I felt like one. Not the startup magazine version, with perfectly staged headshots and TEDx invites. The real kind. The one who knew how to hold everything together with one hand and build with the other. That night, I walked home past a row of billboards near the train station. One of them advertised a competitor's new funding round $6 million. Series A, sleek fonts, smiling founders. I stopped for a second, then kept walking. Because I knew what they didn't. Money doesn't build trust. Consistency does. And our users trusted us. The shift wasn't about recognition. It was about capacity. For the first time, I had room to breathe, to imagine, to plan. I wasn't just reacting to problems anymore, I was leading. Strategically, thoughtfully, confidently. I sat down that weekend and outlined a roadmap for the next 12 months. It wasn't about explosive growth. It was about depth, loyalty, integrity. I wanted to be the platform people recommended, not because it was flashy, but because it worked. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing to be loud. I didn't tweet milestones. I didn't post fundraising threads. I let the product and the people using it do the talking. That was the shift. Not fame, not funding, just finally feeling like I belonged in the seat I built. It was a wedding. Not mine, of course. My cousin Ellie was getting married to someone from Chicago, and the whole family was invited. I hadn't been to a family gathering in over 2 years. Not since that Thanksgiving. Not since the laughter. But Ellie had been kind. She'd always asked questions about what I was building, even when no one else had. So I said yes. I bought a plain navy dress that looked formal enough for photos, but unremarkable enough not to attract attention. I hadn't seen my parents in months. Hadn't spoken to Michael since he sent a 3-word reply to a group family text. Sounds ambitious, Claire. That was his version of engagement. Ambitious. As if I were a toddler trying to build a spaceship out of cardboard. I arrived late on purpose, just before the ceremony started. I slid into a pew near the back, avoiding eye contact, offering polite nods to distant relatives I barely remembered. The wedding itself was beautiful, simple, emotional. I let myself enjoy it. Let the music soften the edges of the armor I'd been wearing for years. When it was over, we filtered outside into the golden hour sun, blinking and smiling and waiting for the dinner reception to begin. That's when it happened. A man I didn't recognize approached me near the cocktail bar. He looked familiar, maybe a friend of the groom. He said my name slowly, like he was testing it. Claire Benton? I nodded. Are you the founder of FlexWise? It caught me off guard. No one in my family had ever said that name out loud. Yes, I said, careful not to sound surprised. He lit up. Said he'd read about our budgeting AI in a tech Substack he followed. Said he'd been meaning to reach out but hadn't connected the dots until someone mentioned I was related to Michael. I smiled, said thank you, exchanged business cards. He moved on, but something had shifted. That brief exchange it echoed. By the time I reached my table, I could feel it. The tilt, the curiosity. Cousins glancing at me like they were seeing me for the first time. My father nodded as I sat down but didn't say anything. My mother smiled too tightly. Michael was already seated, scrolling through his phone. During dinner, conversation buzzed around the table. Work updates, kids, vacation plans. Eventually, someone asked Michael about his latest consulting project. He explained it at length, the way he always did, complete with acronyms and figures no one really understood. I stayed quiet. I was used to this rhythm. Let him take the spotlight. That's how it had always been. But then someone, maybe Ellie's fiancé, turned to me and said, Didn't you just get featured in Founders Monthly? I froze for a second, then nodded. Michael looked up. Just for a second. Founders Monthly? He said, like it was a local paper. My cousin jumped in. Yeah, she's doing something in fintech. Budgeting tools or something? For freelancers? It's a bit more than budgeting, I said softly. It's adaptive income optimization using predictive models. But yes, that's the foundation. Someone asked how many users we had. I told them just shy of 60,000. The table went quiet for a moment. Even the clinking of forks paused. My aunt said, "Wow, that's real." Like she'd expected me to say 6 or 60. I felt my pulse in my ears, but my voice stayed calm. We just rolled out a savings behavior analysis feature last quarter. The feedback's been encouraging. Michael went quiet. He didn't challenge me. He didn't make a joke. He just looked at me, really looked at me for what felt like the first time in years. And in that moment, I understood something. It's easy for people to dismiss you when they think you're behind. But when you pass them, when you quietly, methodically outpace every expectation they had for you, it shakes something loose in them. You become unfamiliar. The rest of the dinner played out like any other. Speeches, toasts, dancing. But I saw the way people looked at me differently. Not with awe, not even with respect, just uncertainty. Like I didn't fit the role they had written for me. Like I'd rewritten it when they weren't paying attention. Later that evening, I caught Michael standing alone near the bar. He wasn't drinking, just scrolling his phone. When he looked up and saw me, there was a moment brief, flickering, where it seemed like he might say something. But he didn't. He nodded once, then walked away. I didn't chase him. I didn't need him to say anything. I wasn't there to prove myself. I wasn't there to demand recognition. I was just there, whole, quiet, steady. That night, as I walked back to my hotel, the air felt lighter. Not because they saw me, but because I no longer needed them to. The validation I used to ache for had melted away somewhere along the long, invisible climb. I had become someone else. Someone who didn't require permission to take up space. That was when they noticed. But by then, I was already too far ahead to care. The request didn't come in with flashing lights or dramatic music. It came as a file attachment in a weekly review packet buried among 10 other pitch decks and internal memos. I was at home when I opened it late afternoon, light spilling through the blinds, coffee half cold beside my keyboard. I scrolled absently through the list of applicants for our fund's Q3 review, eyes scanning for anything that stood out. And then I saw the name. It wasn't Michael's name on the front slide. It was the company's. But I knew it. Of course I knew it. I remembered the name from back when he first joined as a VP, the way he'd boasted at dinner about their Series B closing, the synergies, the growth. But that was 2 years ago, and now they were applying for capital. From my fund. From me. I froze for a moment, not shocked, not even angry, just still. There was something poetic about it, something painfully full circle. The same brother who once called my company adorable at a holiday party was now in a position where he needed help. Strategic guidance, liquidity, funding. I clicked through the deck. It was polished, full of metrics and market opportunity slides, user case studies, revenue projections. But I'd seen enough decks by now to know when someone was presenting a house of cards. It wasn't terrible, but it reeked of desperation. The burn rate was high, retention numbers were shaky, and the projected growth curve looked more like wishful thinking than actual modeling. This wasn't a pitch from a thriving company looking to scale. It was from one trying to stay afloat. I said nothing to the team. No one at the table would have known I had any personal connection. My name had changed when I rebranded the fund. My full legal name wasn't public-facing. I let the application move through the first filter, like all the others. Let my analysts rate it, rank it, leave their comments. One said the valuation was bloated. Another flagged concerns about market saturation. One more noted leadership inconsistency. And I wondered, for a flicker of a second, if they knew they were referring to my brother. The next week, during our team pipeline sync, the deck resurfaced. It had made the second round, barely. Not because it was promising, because it was salvageable. One of my senior partners asked if we should move them to the diligence phase. I nodded, kept my voice neutral. Let's give them a chance to present. I didn't warn Michael. I didn't reach out. I didn't call my parents or ask for details. I didn't want to know why they were struggling. I only wanted to see what he would do when he walked into that room. A week later, the meeting was scheduled. I walked into the conference room early, as I always did. My assistant placed the printed decks at each seat, and I reviewed the notes one final time. I wore my usual uniform sleek black blazer. No jewelry, hair tied back. I didn't want to distract from what was about to happen. I wanted to be forgettable in appearance, unmissable in presence. When the door opened and the team filed in, I saw him last. He didn't see me at first. He was focused on the setup, on handing out materials, on adjusting his laptop. Then he looked up, and his face shifted. He froze mid-step, just for a moment. I watched the realization wash over him, the flicker of recognition, the recalibration. I met his eyes for half a second. Not with malice, not with triumph, just acknowledgement. Then I turned to the agenda and began the meeting. He introduced his team, made his pitch, walked us through the product, the numbers, the future vision. His voice was steady, his performance rehearsed. But I could see it the way his hand tightened around the clicker, the way his eyes kept darting back to me, searching for a clue. He didn't mention our relationship, didn't break the illusion. Neither did I. When the pitch ended, we asked questions, tough ones. My team didn't hold back. They flagged red flags I'd already seen, asked about pivots, about attrition, about new user growth. Michael answered them all. Some well, some not. I didn't go easy. I wasn't cruel. But I asked questions only someone who understood weakness would ask. Questions about leadership turnover, about cultural gaps, about why the team's core metrics had stagnated for 2 quarters. He answered each one without looking directly at me. His voice never cracked, but I could feel the weight behind every word. When it was over, we thanked them and dismissed the team. As they left, he glanced at me again, this time longer, as if waiting for something. A signal, a word, a flicker of familiarity. I gave him nothing. After the door closed, the room was quiet. My team began to debrief, and I let them speak first. I kept my tone even, my feedback crisp. The consensus was clear. The company was risky, but not beyond saving. It would require a full restructuring, a new leadership framework, possibly an external interim to stabilize the operations. We didn't decide that day. But I knew that my brother would soon learn what it meant to need something from someone he had once dismissed. And still, I felt no vengeance, no fire, only silence. I had become someone he couldn't define anymore. And that was worth more than any yes or no. The meeting room was quiet in that heavy way, right before something important begins. Not nervous quiet, not tense but intentional, controlled. I sat at the end of the table, laptop open, pen resting diagonally across my notepad. The sun filtered in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long lines across the glass tabletop. Everything felt too bright, too precise, like the moment had been architected to expose anything false. It had been a week since Michael pitched. After several rounds of internal debate, the team agreed to schedule a follow-up face-to-face to discuss restructuring terms and expectations for a possible investment. We were prepared to offer a conditional deal, but one that would come with strict provisions. I'd seen enough companies implode from pride to know that clarity was the only kindness you could offer a drowning business. And this one was flailing, whether they admitted it or not. When he entered the room, he didn't hesitate, not the way he had during the pitch. This time, he walked in with a straight back and practiced ease, a calm professionalism I recognized because I had learned to wear it myself. But I also recognized what was behind it: calculation. I knew he'd spent the week preparing not just numbers and slides, but a strategy for dealing with me, the sister he hadn't seen in years, now sitting between him and a financial lifeline. He nodded politely as he sat down, acknowledging everyone with the same pleasant tone he once used in boardrooms full of older men. I wondered if he even knew that one of my partners, a woman named Lee, had flagged him as a potential ego risk in her review notes. Over-indexed on confidence, under-indexed on adaptability. She'd nailed it without even knowing he was my brother. We started the session the way we always did. Review of the metrics, a walkthrough of operational adjustments they'd already made since the pitch, updated user data. Michael spoke fluidly. His co-founder chimed in occasionally, more cautiously, clearly deferring to Michael's lead. They had changed some things. Tweaked messaging, adjusted pricing tiers. They were trying. It wasn't a turnaround yet, but it was motion. When my turn came, I didn't look at him any differently than I did anyone else. I asked what needed to be asked. Not to corner him, not to humiliate, but because this was business. My fund's money came with responsibility to our LPs, to our team, to the founders we chose to back. If he expected sentiment to soften my edge, he was wrong. And maybe he knew that now. He didn't argue when I questioned their team's retention data. He didn't flinch when I pointed out the inconsistency in their growth channels. He answered. Straight, focused. But every now and then, his eyes would flicker to mine, searching for something. A crack, a softness, a memory. I didn't give him one. It wasn't cruelty. It was distance, earned distance. I'd spent so many years trying to earn a place at tables he took for granted. And now, here we were. No Thanksgiving turkey between us, no awkward family small talk, just P&Ls, cap tables, and exit potential. I wondered, for a moment, what he was thinking. If he remembered the dinner when he called my business a phase. If he recalled the smirk he gave when I told him I'd built my first MVP. If he ever thought about the silence that followed after I stopped showing up to birthdays and holidays, not out of spite, but because I couldn't sit at a table that only had space for his story. Toward the end of the meeting, I gave the formal summary of our proposed terms. There would be an investment modest, but enough to extend their runway. It came with clear contingencies: an external interim COO, weekly reporting, a cap on discretionary spend. They could take it or leave it. We didn't need them. And now, he knew it. He took a breath, as if about to say something personal, then caught himself. Instead, he nodded. Said they'd review with their legal team. Standard protocol. No emotion. No acknowledgement. As the team filed out, one by one, he lingered for a moment. We were the last two in the room. He looked at me. Really looked at me. I thought maybe, just maybe, he'd say it. Not an apology. Just the truth. That he saw it now. That I'd done what he thought I never could. But he didn't. He stood there for a few seconds too long, then nodded once more and turned to leave. And I let him go. Because I didn't need that moment. Not anymore. The face-to-face wasn't a reckoning. It was a reckoning for him, maybe. For me, it was confirmation. I didn't need his recognition. I didn't need to prove anything. I had already become the kind of woman who didn't need her past to validate her future. He had come to my table, sat across from me, played by my rules. That was enough. The decision wasn't made in a single dramatic vote or with some grand theatrical moment of me sliding a contract across the table. It happened quietly, in pieces, over several days of internal discussion, spreadsheets, late-night emails, and strategic calculations. On paper, their company made sense as a risk. Not a safe bet, but a salvageable one. And that's what made the process even more intense. I had to remove myself from it emotionally. I couldn't allow my history with Michael to become part of the equation, even if his face still flickered in my mind at night, like a light I hadn't fully turned off. After the in-person meeting, my team retreated into what we called diligence lock mode, a polite term for several days of hard scrutiny. We dissected their numbers, called references, spoke to ex-employees, looked for cracks that couldn't be patched. And there were cracks, but none that couldn't be sealed with the right leadership and oversight. That was the key. Leadership. The company didn't need more capital. It needed discipline, infrastructure, a recentering of purpose. And Michael, brilliant, bold, reckless. Michael wasn't going to deliver that on his own. Not unless he was willing to be held accountable in a way I wasn't sure he'd ever experienced. I wasn't interested in being the sister who bailed him out. I was the managing partner now. And that title came with obligations that extended far beyond bloodlines. The hardest part wasn't the analysis. It was the silence. The long pauses in conversation where I could feel the unspoken question lingering. "Claire, are you okay with this?" No one asked it outright, but I knew they were watching me, wondering if I'd flinch, if I'd crumble, if some hidden resentment would erupt and compromise the process. But I didn't flinch. I stayed steady. I kept my voice even and my points precise. Because this wasn't about old wounds. This was about clarity. Late one night, I stayed in the office after everyone left, scrolling through the company's timeline, reading every article that had mentioned them since they launched. I studied Michael's press quotes, the way he talked about innovation and risk and disruption. He was always good with words. But I looked for more than that now. I looked for action, for follow-through, for data that matched the promises. Eventually, I opened a blank document and wrote the term sheet myself. I adjusted the numbers, added the clauses we'd agreed on, and paused before typing the final paragraph, the one that outlined the governance structure. It was firm. It was fair. It was non-negotiable. If they wanted the money, they'd accept an external COO, with full authority to override Michael if performance metrics weren't met in the first 2 quarters. It felt clinical, detached, but also right, not just professionally, but personally. I wasn't hurting him. I was offering him the exact kind of structure he'd always resisted, the kind that could have saved him from the very position he now found himself in. I saved the document and sent it to our legal team. I didn't hesitate. I didn't reread it 10 times like I used to when I was starting out. I just clicked send and leaned back in my chair. The city lights blurred through the glass behind me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was trying to keep up with the world around me. I was steering it. 2 days later, Michael's co-founder emailed us back with a request for a follow-up call. It was standard. They wanted to go over the clauses, see if anything could be softened. We scheduled the call. And when it happened, Michael was quiet for most of it. He let his partner speak, asked a few measured questions, tried to mask the disappointment. But I could feel it how hard it was for him to accept the new power dynamics. He'd always been the one in control, always been the one who walked into a room and commanded it. But now he was on the other side of the table. And I wasn't angry. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. At the end of the call, they accepted the terms. The paperwork was signed 3 days later. My assistant handed me the final copy, neatly bound, and I placed it in the secure cabinet with all our active investments. Just another folder. Just another name. But I stood there a moment longer than usual, fingertips resting on the spine. I didn't call anyone afterward. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even write about it in my journal. There was nothing left to process. The decision had been made. Not just to fund the company, but to choose who I was now. And who I wasn't anymore. I wasn't the girl begging for space at the dinner table. I wasn't the younger sister desperate to be taken seriously. I wasn't even the founder fighting to be heard. I was the one who said yes. On my terms. With a steady hand. And that was enough. Recognition doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it shows up in the form of silence, not the kind that's cold or punishing, but the kind that settles between people when there's nothing left to deny. That was what it felt like the day I received the email. It was from Michael. The subject line was empty, just his name and the timestamp blinking back at me. For a moment, I considered deleting it without reading. Not out of malice, but because I didn't need it. Not anymore. But curiosity isn't something you lose, no matter how far you think you've grown past someone. So I opened it. It was short. 2 lines. I read your terms again. They were clear. Firm. Fair. You've built something real. No greeting. No sign-off. No apology. But something in those words anchored me to my chair. I reread them slowly, letting the weight of their simplicity sink in. He hadn't praised the product. He hadn't acknowledged our relationship. What he acknowledged was me, my authority, my judgment, my creation. It wasn't the kind of message you forward or screenshot or save in a folder labeled validation. But I didn't need it to be, because the truth is, I had stopped chasing that kind of recognition long before the email arrived. I had stopped waiting for my name to be spoken in rooms I wasn't invited to. I had stopped hoping to be understood by people who had never made the effort. I had stopped performing. But this was different. Not theatrical, not loud. It was neutral, honest. A small crack of humility from a man who had built his identity around certainty. And somehow, that made it more powerful than any public gesture. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because there was nothing to say. His recognition didn't require acknowledgement. I wasn't keeping score. I wasn't waiting to balance the emotional books. I had already moved forward. This was just punctuation. The same week, my face appeared on a list of top 10 female investors reshaping venture capital. A journalist I'd spoken with months ago finally published her piece. The write-up was respectful, thorough. It didn't sensationalize my journey or paint me as a one-woman miracle. It just laid out the facts, growth numbers, founder testimonials, quiet but consistent returns. She had quoted me saying something I barely remembered, saying, "Some of the best investments I've ever made started with someone telling me the idea was too small to matter." I smiled when I read it, because that used to be me. Too small to matter, too soft to lead. A few days later, I was asked to speak at a panel. Then another. Then a third. I said yes to only one. A local event for young women starting bootstrapped companies. No press, no live stream. Just 30 folding chairs in a community co-working space. Some fruit on a tray and a shaky mic. I told my story honestly. The rejection, the silence, the climb. Not the glossed over version, the real one. Afterward, a girl came up to me, maybe 22, and said, "I thought I was the only one who felt stupid for trying." I looked her straight in the eyes and said, "You're not. And you're not stupid," she cried. I almost did too. Recognition had changed shape for me. It used to be something I craved. A hunger in my chest that wouldn't leave me alone. Now it felt quieter. Like a nod between people who had both walked through fire. I didn't need headlines or handshakes. I needed to look in the mirror and feel aligned with the woman staring back. Still, it was hard to ignore the ripple effect. My parents, who had once changed the subject when I talked about work, now asked questions. Careful ones, but genuine. My mother mentioned she'd read an article about me, she didn't say which one, and I didn't press. My father sent a short message. Proud of you. It didn't land quite right, but I appreciated the effort. I wasn't angry at them anymore. I just didn't need them to understand everything. Some bridges don't need to be burned or crossed. They just stay where they are, and that's okay. At the next quarterly meeting, one of our younger associates pulled me aside. She said, "It's weird people talk about you differently now, like they finally get it." I laughed. "That's their journey," I said, and I meant it. Recognition didn't arrive as a wave. It arrived as a steady trickle. A shift in the tone of voices, the way eyes met mine across a room, the way people waited for my opinion instead of filling in the silence themselves. It wasn't validation. It was presence. And presence can't be taken. It's earned. That was the real win. Not that they saw me, but that I no longer needed them to. I had become undeniable. Not because I screamed to be heard, but because I built something strong enough to speak for me. And finally, the world had started listening. Legacy is a word people throw around too easily. They make it sound like a statue or a plaque or a building with your name on it. But I learned that legacy isn't what people remember about you. It's what stays behind when you're no longer in the room. It's the systems you leave working. The people you leave stronger. The silence you no longer feel the need to fill. Years passed. The fund kept growing. We expanded our portfolio, not fast, but with precision. I stopped trying to prove I could build something and started focusing on what kind of builder I wanted to be. I no longer chased momentum. I built systems that could hold it. I became selective. Not just about companies, but about energy. I backed founders who reminded me of myself, not in story, but in spirit. People who had been laughed at, dismissed, spoken over. People who didn't come from pitch boot camps or Ivy League accelerators, but from kitchens and side gigs and impossible rent. I taught them how to defend their models, how to say no without apology, how to stay when it gets quiet. I never became loud. I never filled stages or built a personal brand around resilience. I didn't need to. The companies we backed spoke for us. Their survival, their traction, their growth, that was the story. And in rooms where deals were made, people started asking what I thought first. That shift came slowly, almost imperceptibly, until one day I realized I hadn't been talked over in months. Michael's company stayed afloat. Not spectacularly, not glamorously, but stable. The COO we installed turned out to be a brilliant operator. Michael adjusted, quietly. I never reached out, neither did he. We remained civil, professional, respectful. I heard he was mentoring young founders now. I wondered if he told them about me. I doubted it, but it didn't matter. I wasn't looking for that version of legacy anymore. I began writing memos for our team internal essays about decision-making, about pacing, about fear. At first, they were just notes. Then they became shared docs. Then, eventually, someone compiled them into a handbook we gave to new hires. They called it the Quiet Manual. I didn't name it, but I liked that they did. It felt right. Every year, I chose one founder to mentor deeply. No agenda, no equity, just time. The first was a woman named Samira. She had built a budgeting tool for domestic caregivers. She was brilliant and anxious and constantly on the edge of quitting. I didn't give her strategies, I gave her space. I showed her how to stay in the chair when everything felt like failure. I told her the story of the night. I almost emailed myself a resignation letter. She didn't cry when I told her. She laughed. That laugh stayed with me for weeks. I wasn't interested in empire. I was interested in endurance. In succession, I began transitioning operational power to a younger partner named Kayla, who had started as our intern. She saw everything, every closed-door decision, every messy pivot. She had earned the trust not by saying the right things but by being steady in storms. I never called it stepping back. I just took longer lunches, answered fewer emails, let her lead more meetings. I knew when it was time, and I didn't need to be the one holding the pen anymore. At our 5-year fund anniversary, we had a small gathering. No stage, no speeches, just our team. A handful of founders and a wall covered in handwritten thank you notes from the people we had backed. Someone pointed out that my name wasn't mentioned in most of them. I smiled. That meant it worked. That meant I hadn't made it about me. Later that evening, a young woman approached me. She held a notebook to her chest like armor and asked, "How did you know when you were done?" I thought about it for a long moment. Then I said, "You're never done. You just stop needing to be seen doing it." She wrote it down. That was my legacy. Not a moment, not a headline, but a ripple. Not that I succeeded, but that I stayed. Not that I shouted, but that I built something worth listening to. And long after the emails stop and the rooms get quiet again, I know the work will go on steady, relentless, quiet. Just like me. Just like it always was.